Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of A Happy Moment. My name is Dan, and I'm glad to have you join me today. I'm going to be going through the 1931 film Dracula, based on the novel by Bram Stoker. This movie stars Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula and is directed by Todd Browning. We start with a carriage traveling through what I believe is the Carpathian Mountains in Europe. The people inside are talking about the need to reach the village before the sun goes down. One of these travelers is Renfield, our main character for the first part of the movie. Upon reaching the village, the locals try to convince him to spend the night and leave after sunrise, but Renfield is here on business and insists he must go on to Borgo Pass, where a waiting carriage will take him to Castle Dracula. He leaves, but one of the villagers gives him a cross for safety. We cut to what looks like an underground lair, presumably at the castle, and Dracula and his wives are rising from their coffins. Renfield is quickly dropped off by his carriage at Borgo Pass, where he boards a carriage driven by what looks like a hooded Dracula, who silently watches Renfield. At one point during the trip, Renfield looks out the window and sees a bat in place of the driver. They arrive at the castle, and it's apparent that Dracula needs to hire a housekeeper. Cobwebs everywhere, and the place is quite dilapidated. We even see a pair of armadillos wandering around. I'd be curious to know what went into that decision. Okay, guys, how can we make this castle even more creepy? What's that? Armadillos? Brilliant! I don't know what director Todd Browning sounds like, so I'm just gonna go with that. Fortunately, the upstairs is nicer than downstairs and actually looks quite cozy. There's a nice bed in the corner of the room and a fireplace with a fire burning. Renfield has papers for Dracula to sign to lease property in Carfax Abbey in England, and they plan to take a boat to London the next day. Renfield suffers a nasty paper cut, and the Count watches hungrily at the blood that dribbles out. After a drink of strong wine, Renfield passes out. The wives of Dracula approach him, but are waved off by Dracula, who crouches down by the unconscious Renfield. Our next shot is of Renfield, who is now crazed and a servant to Dracula, aboard the boat to London. Dracula kills the crew, and a newspaper article tells us that a madman, Renfield, was the only survivor found, and he was taken to Dr. Seward's sanitarium due to his raving about eating bugs. Meanwhile, Dracula was safe and sound inside his coffin. We see Dracula, looking all elegant, striding through the London streets. Amid the cover of the fog, he was able to murder a young woman. He proceeds to the theater, where he meets Dr. Seward, his daughter Mina, her fiancé Jonathan, and their friend Lucy. We learn that the doctor's sanitarium and residence are across the street from Carfax Abbey. That night, Lucy, who also lives at the sanitarium, has a bat fly in her bedroom window, which transforms to Dracula. He then proceeds to bite her neck. Our next shot is of a room of doctors at a medical classroom, studying Lucy's corpse and noting the bite marks on her neck and loss of blood. We then see Renfield at the sanitarium trying to eat a spider because, apparently, flies aren't good enough anymore. Now we're in a room of doctors and professors, including Dr. Seward, and we're introduced to the character of Van Helsing, who believes there is a vampire responsible for the deaths of Lucy and others who have similar bite marks. The others are skeptical, though, and believe vampires to be a myth. Van Helsing is played by Edward Van Sloan, who does really well in this role as the crafty and knowledgeable professor. Dr. Seward introduces Van Helsing to Renfield. Van Helsing produces a branch of wolfsbane which angers Renfield. The professor explains it's used to ward off vampires. This is the only time I can recall wolfsbane referenced in a vampire movie. I think in future movies it was replaced by garlic. That night, Dracula bites Mina while she sleeps. Unlike Lucy, she survives and tells her father and Harker about horrible nightmares she's been having. While they're talking, Count Dracula arrives to visit, and Dr. Seward introduces him to Van Helsing. Van Helsing is suspicious of Dracula's interest in Mina and tricks him into looking at a mirror, which of course there is no reflection because vampires don't have a reflection in mirrors. Dracula immediately strikes the mirror down and leaves. Harker looks out the window after him and only sees a wolf running across the yard. Van Helsing tells Harker and Seward that Dracula is the vampire, although they don't really believe him. After Dracula had arrived, her father had sent her to her room, but now we see Mina in a trance-like state going outside to see awaiting Dracula. Van Helsing, Harker, and Seward continue to chat and are interrupted by Renfield, who seems to be tattling on Dracula. and indicates that what Van Helsing says about him is true. But then he stops when a giant bat appears and Renfield starts begging forgiveness. They're interrupted by the screaming of a maid, and they run outside to find an unconscious Mina. The next morning, there's talk of newspaper articles about children being attacked near the graveyard by a woman in white, which is Lucy, who is now undead. Later that day, Harker's becoming upset at Van Helsing, accusing him of making Mina crazy with his talk of vampires. Van Helsing insists it's for her own good and prepares her bedroom with wolfsbane to try and keep her safe. Dracula arrives at the sanitarium and encounters Van Helsing, who is all alone. He attempts to use his hypnotism powers, but Van Helsing is too strong-willed and resists. He then produces a crucifix to chase Dracula away. We see Mina, who appears to be very energetic now, and has an attitude change and says she feels much better. But then while she's sitting outside with Harker, the giant bat appears again, and appears to be talking to her. After Harker chases the bat away, Mina attempts to bite him, but Van Helsing arrives in time to stop her with the crucifix. A now terrified Mina confesses everything that Dracula has done to her. That night, Dracula sneaks into Mina's room and takes her away. Harker and Van Helsing spy Renfield outside and follow him. He leads them unwittingly to Dracula and Mina at the Abbey. When Dracula finds out that Renfield was followed, he kills him. But killing Renfield stalls Dracula and gives Harker and Van Helsing a chance to break inside the Abbey. Harker and Van Helsing search the Abbey until they find Dracula's coffin and an entranced Mina standing silently. Van Helsing opens Dracula's coffin and drives a stake through his heart. With Dracula dead, Mina snaps out of her trance, and she and Harker walk up the stairs, and that is the end. This is a fun movie with a creepy premise, as the thought of a creature who survives by drinking human blood is unsettling, but it is slower paced, and the ending feels a bit anticlimactic as Dracula goes down without any kind of struggle. He's simply asleep in his coffin, and there's no resistance as Van Helsing finishes him. This is also a rather quiet movie with very little music, but the Blu-ray does have an alternate score you can enable. It is a little bit difficult for me to watch this movie and keep a straight face, only because it and other Dracula movies was spoofed superbly in the comedy Dracula Dead and Loving It, which is an excellent movie and I highly recommend it. So I've already mentioned the performance of Edward Van Sloan's Van Helsing, but let's not forget about the main attraction, Dracula. Bela Lugosi has a great performance as a regal, suave vampire. He's also a stark contrast to the Count from the first movie adaptation of Bram Stoker's book, Nosferatu. That version of the vampire was definitely more creepy and not the ladies' man that Lugosi was. Lugosi would go on to appear in other notable roles in the Universal Monster Universe, including taking his turn as Frankenstein's monster, but he would only play the role of Dracula one more time, and that came almost 20 years after this movie. That's all for today's episode. Next up in my look at the classic Universal Monster movies will be Frankenstein. Thank you so much for joining me. You can reach out to me on Twitter at @AHappyMomentPod if you have any feedback or questions. I'll see you next time. Bye.